this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another top 5 list this month for the beginning of May, right after the release of the Streets of New Campenna. As a friendly reminder, if you do like modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, as we aim to be the most informative modern channel for Magic the Gathering on YouTube. So we're going to start out with an honorable mention this time before we get into the top 5, and that is Blue Living End. So this is a variant of the various Cascade decks that you'll see: Glimpse, Cascading Rhinos. This one is probably the easier of the decks to hang out, and possibly the easier to play, but also the most difficult to play through hate. The reason why this one's a little bit more difficult to play through hate is it's vulnerable to both Graveyard Hate and the additional cards that you can use to attack the Cascade mechanic itself. You know, things like Chalice the Void and Teferi Time Raveler are also vulnerable to, Rest in Peace, Leyline the Void, Endurance, etc. Now, while you do have some counterplay in the form of things that we'll get in the sideboard, Game 1, generally you want to win. Game 2 and Game 3, you have to learn to play through hate. What this deck is trying to do is it's trying to play a bunch of cycling creatures, get them into the graveyard, and then use either Shardless Agent or Violent Outburst, Cascade and Living End, bring all their stuff back, kill all of your opponent's creatures, and kill them in a swing or two. Generally a very effective strategy. First couple of turns are generally spent setting up. So basically you're just playing things like you're cycling Curator of Mysteries, you're evoking a Grief, you're cycling Architects of Will, Street Wraith, Colossal Sky Turtle, which is one of the newer additions to the deck, which allows you to return target card from your graveyard to hand, which is quite a nice thing. Allows you to deal with your, needing a Cascader again if your opponent counters it or kills it by chance. So this allows you to rebuy, which is quite nice. New angle of attack that I haven't seen in versions that I've played in the past, and then start to deliver a reminder. And then Waker of Waves, just a very powerful thing. It allows you to put multiple things in the graveyard at a turn. You get to play a 3-color mana base with an island and a forest, and then you have a couple of Otawaros in here. Nothing too special, and then generally they play 3 copies of Living End. You really don't want to draw a Living End in this deck, but you also don't want to run out of copies that your opponent can counter. And then Subtlety is a nice little interaction along with Grease in the main board. Force of Negation, once again, card you can play to protect your combo, especially if you're going on your opponent's instant with Violent Outburst, or you can use it to protect, from, say, I don't even know what would come up in game number 1, your opponent's Tron payoff or whatever. Sideboard is where things get interesting. Like I said, you are vulnerable to graveyard hate, so you're going to see a lot of permanent-based graveyard hate, whether it be Leyline the Void, Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus, all the different ones that you see out of the years of Saga decks. So you kind of have to have a combination of different plays around that. You have Force of Vigor and Foundation Breaker to blow up any of the permanent-based ones, which are generally enchantments or artifacts. You have a couple copies of Endurance to fight your opponent's things. Previously, this deck would play things like Fairy Macabre, and then Endurance just does what it wants to do better, especially pitching it in the graveyard, although this deck does not play a ton of green cards. Leyline of Sanctity serves a couple points of purpose. Number 1, it keeps people from hitting you with things like Thoughtseize and Burn spells, but also keeps you from being targeted by things like Endurance, Tormod's Crypt, etc. So this is good against some of the targeted graveyard hate, and also happens to be instantly good against one of the deck's worst matchups in a deck like Burn. A couple copies of Subtlety helps you to deal with things like Teferi Time Raveler is the main one that I can think of, but also can time walk your opponent's important play. And then a couple copies of Mystical Dispute just to kind of help round out against the other blue-based decks, which can be difficult to resolve your combo through. Leyline the Void pairs with your Endurances for the Graveyard Mirrors. And that's kind of deck number 5B, whatever you want to call it. One of its sister decks is further up the list, but I think this one definitely deserves a mention, and a lot of people did mention it in the comments in the previous video that I didn't give a shout out to any of the Cascade decks. So that's it. Let's get to deck number 5. Deck number 5, now you could argue this deck, based on recent performances, could possibly be higher on the list. I chose to put it at number 5, and that is Golgar Yagmoth, which is a black rock-based mid-range deck that has a infinite combo based around Yagmoth, Threat of Physician. This is one of the few true creature decks that remain in the format that are viable. A lot of that is due to the resilience and just the outright stupidity this deck is capable of. There's a lot of grinding elements to this deck with things like Grist, Quarter Calling for finding your different pieces. You run Undying creatures. So you have a lot of built-in resistance to 1-for-1 removal, except for against the Yagmoth itself, which Yagmoth isn't necessarily the easiest thing to kill. Would require Prismatic Ending on 4, March for 4, would require 2 burn spells generally, and it's not the easiest thing to target. Now obviously things like Path, Revolted Fatal Push, etc. can still deal with it, and Unholy Heat can kill it. But you're already kind of taxing your opponent's stuff with your mana dorks, with your various different things you're doing with the deck. And the deck can definitely play a grind game. This deck used to be much more of the all-in on the combo with things like Geralt's Messenger and stuff. Nowadays it uses different variants to get through what it's trying to do. A lot of the combos obviously revolve around Yagmoth and 2 Undying creatures. And what you do from there is either things like Blood Artist or Geralt's Messenger to kind of get your opponent dead. So the combination is if you get a Yagmoth in play, you get 2 Undying creatures, they get to bounce back and forth, ticking the Undying counter off of each other as they're ticking away. Geralt's Messenger, if it happens to be the one, for every 2 life you spend, you're dealing 2 life to your opponent. Blood Artist allows you to do this. It's kind of an added step to the thing. You have to have 2 Undying creatures plus the Blood Artist, but allows you to do infinite draw, etc. And oh yeah, by the way, while you're doing all this, and paying 1 life, you're drawing a card every time. So, obviously your life total is an important resource, and this gets very powerful. Then you have Chord and Eldritch Evolution kind of tying it all together. As far as the deck, you are a main acceleration deck. You have Ignoble Hierarchs, you have Birds of Paradise, you have Wool of Roots. And then you have your Undying creatures in Young Wolf, Strangleroot Geist, and Geralt's Messenger. One of Endurance is a nice little hedge against a lot of the different graveyard decks, like the aforementioned Living End that we were just talking about, or just knocking some value out of your opponent's graveyard, as a lot of decks have incidental value out of the graveyard. Grist, very wonderful grinding tool, also can threaten to win the game. And then obviously Yagmoth, the whole thing tying it together, very powerful card, and don't underestimate the Proliferate. This is one of the few decks that also gets to play, or if it chooses to play, can play both copies of Urborg and, what is the name, Yavimaya. If it wanted to, I see in this list they're choosing to also play a couple copies of Besiju instead. So this is one of the few lists that can get away with playing both of the all lands or swamps, all lands or forests things, and it does quite nicely. Gets a little bit of utility land with Nurture and Repeat land. And obviously Dryad Arbor to fetch up with your fetch lands, which is relevant with your Yawgmoth, and also your Court of Culling. And then beyond that, you have a couple forests and a swamp to be able to play through Blood Moon. Sideboard. Sideboard in these decks gets a little weird because different pilots have different ideas. Necromentia, primarily for combo, can also use it against an important piece of your opponent's disruption. But once again, primarily for combo, like Cascade, etc. 2 copies of Thoughtseize, once again, to also help disrupt. Megas is a little bit of a newer addition to the deck, especially considering you don't have a actual red source in the deck outside of your Birds of Paradise, it looks like. I mean, yeah, you can Chord for it, so it's not that outlandish, but I'm guessing this is primarily here for Amulet, as I could see that being a tough matchup. A couple copies of Chalice. Now, I've seen this brought in against me as a burn player. I don't think it's particularly the best thing, considering they had a bunch of 1-drops in their own deck, but, it can get you in a pinch. Crime and Punishment. You're primarily here for the punishment, to kind of, a pernicious deed kind of effect on the board. Wipe your opponent's small ball stuff. With Veil of Summer against any type of counterspell nonsense, and the additional endurances against any type of graveyard crap, Force of Vigor and Outland Liberator against any style of permanent-based hate that you're expecting out of your opponents, maybe, Blood Moons of their own, etc. And then 1 Seteshan Petitioner as a kind of hedge against things like Burn and other aggressive decks. So that is number 5 on our list. Definitely could be higher up, but, this has only been more recently that it's been back on the upswing. So what is number 4? Let's get into that in a second. Number 4, well, this one didn't have the best weekend of all the big events with the SCG events and the Modern challenges this past weekend. It's a deck that continues to put up amazing results. And while we did have it number 5 on last list, I do think this is a list that moves kind of up to number 4 by default. And that is Hammer Time. This is a deck that you kind of have to respect. It is the de facto combo aggressive deck of the format, and even with the loss of Lurrus, it's not going away. Obviously, the combination of Colossal Hammer and ways to equip it, as well as Stoneforge Mystic to go fetch it, Some of these versions play Steel Shaper's Gift. So the deck has remarkable consistency, remarkable redundancy, and also has a pretty decent plan B with, oh yeah, it gets to play 4 copies of Urza's Saga. Beyond that, you have the Stoneforge Mystic package with Caldera Complete and Nettle Assist. You also have Reality Chip to play a little bit of a grindier game. And then beyond that, you just have different ways to protect your creatures. Some versions go for, more Esper Sentinels Giver of Runes. Others go for more utility in their decks. This version decided to go for Esper Sentinel, Stoneforge Mystic, Pure Steel Paladin, and very light on some of the other stuff you'll see in some of the other versions. Like I said, redundancy is one of its big keys. Steel Shaper's Gift, along with Stoneforge Mystic and the Hammers, give you basically 14, 16 copies of Hammer with Urza's Sagas to be able to go fetch them. And then you use Pure Steel Paladin and Sigarda's Aid to be able to equip them. Beyond that, you have a copy of Shadow Spear, and then Paradise Mantle. Some versions play Springleaf Drum. This version is playing both Springleaf Drum and Paradise Mantle. And then Caldera Complete as kind of the top-end threat with your Stoneforge Mystic sometimes. A lot of times Stoneforge Mystic just comes in and it's not that threatening unless you're a counterspell deck. To be able to slide the Hammer through. Whereas with Caldera Complete, the Stoneforge Mystic becomes another must-kill threat, which really stretches your removal thin. There aren't a lot of ways to attack this other than a boatload of removal and artifact destruction. And while you can obviously keep them under control, this is a deck that does have a lot of redundancy, so you need to basically never let your guard down. It's because they can do the chip-in plan, and then they can do the boom, kill you plan with Inkmoth Nexus and just nonsense. As far as the sideboard, this version, 4 copies of Blacksmith's Skill, basically allows you to protect your creatures from removal. 2 copies of March of Otherworldly Light, quite a nice catch-all removal spell, especially when you're dealing with annoying things. And you're playing a mostly white deck, so you don't always have to hard cast it. 2 copies of Spell Pierce to disrupt the combo decks along with Teferi. As we've mentioned, a lot of these Cascade decks are vulnerable to Fairy. And then Lavinia. Whenever a opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter this spell. Pretty good against Evoke Elementals, pretty good against Cascaded Spells, pretty good against Tron. So, lots of different things this hits. And then 2 copies of Relic of Progenitus to kind of tie in, or a Relic of Progenitus and a Pithing Needle to kind of round out your Urza's Saga Hate package. Okay, that's it. Let's get on to number 3. Number 3, Cascade, particularly Cascade Rhinos, however you wish to describe it. This deck is a very powerful combo mid-range deck that also revolves around the Cascade mechanic, much like the Living End deck, except for this one is doing into Crushing Footfalls, which allows you to put a bunch of Rhinos into play. So oftentimes you're either putting down 8 power at instant speed or 10 power on turn 3, forcing your opponent to react to it, and then using things like Force of Negation, Brazen Borrower, Bone Crusher Giant, Fire Ice, and copies of Dead Gone to keep you alive until that point. So basically this deck, you cannot play anything less than 3, but this deck gets around that by playing the split cards as well as the adventure creatures, which allow you to interact on 1 and 2, which is very important in a format like Modern, and obviously you have things like Force of Negation to tide you over to keep your opponent's like Expedition Map or whatever from resolving on turn 1 or turn 2. Fury kind of ties it all together, allowing you to remove creatures, also is a pretty solid mid-range threat. One of the key things with this deck is you have to keep the Cascade spell from resolving. If you can keep the Cascade spell from resolving, this deck often at times has a huge problem with closing out the game in a fairly timely manner. This deck also gets to play a bunch of the new things from Kamigawa, the Otawaro, and Boseiju. So it gets to work a lot of things into a mana base, and then gets to play Gemstone Caverns on top of it, so when they're on the draw, they can even cheat and go, well, not really cheat, but go ahead as far as mana and such. This is a deck that mulligans particularly well. It's mainly looking for a Cascader and a little bit of interaction. And oh yeah, on top of all that, it gets to play Blood Moon. So, very powerful deck, very easy to play in Game 1, Game 2, and Game 3 as you're facing, Damping Spheres and Void Mirrors and Chalices and Teferi Time Ravelers. It begins to be a little bit harder and you have to be a little bit more on top of your game. As far as the sideboard, you You have 4 copies of Endurance along with Ashiok against any type of graveyard nonsense. Ashiok also happens to be good against Amulet. Force of Vigor gives you outs to all those different hate pieces that we just talked about. Chandra and Awakened Inferno is pretty good against any of the blue-white X-based decks. Narset, not too sure about this one. I'm sure there's a reason why. Vendilion Click gives you a little bit of instant speed interaction. You maybe clear your opponent's hand at end step of their counterspell, force them to counter that, and then 3 copies of Mystical Dispute for any type of blue decks. One thing this deck can do is it can turn into a bad tempo deck in the post-board games. Your opponent's expecting, all these cascade spells, and then you just turn into this Brazen Borrower, Vendilion Click, Endurance, Violent Outburst kind of tempo-based deck with Petty Theft and Force of Negation and Mystical Dispute, kind of tempoing your opponent out a little bit, play an in-step threat, start chipping away, force them to react, then tap down for your Cascade spell. This deck has a very decent plan B, although it's not necessarily modern power worthy. But if your opponent is, forced to mulligan aggressively for their hate pieces, sometimes that also is good enough to get there. So, what is number 2? Number 2, and this is a caveat. So, last list we had 4-color control as number 1. This time it's not. Spoiler alert. But this deck has a lot in common with 4-color control. It's running a lot of the same elements. You're seeing the same planeswalkers. You're seeing the same, Teferi Time, Rabble, or Run in 6, Solitude, Fury. But for some reason, the Elemental package is on the rise again, and basically you can tell that because of the presence of Risen Reef, which is really the only difference, that and Eldamari's Call. Otherwise, they're running a lot of the same cards. So a lot of it comes down to is, do you want to play counterspells, or do you want to play even more card advantage and play this mid-range, overpower you nonsense game? You're obviously running things like Utopia Sprawl and Abundant Growth, so your mana is quite good. This is a 4-color pile that somehow gets to play Magus of the Moon. How is this even possible in Magic sometimes? Titania, which is, I'm not quite sure why this is in there, other than works nicely with fetch lands. It's an 80-card Urion pile. The world is your oyster when everything says draw a card. I don't know what else I could say about this deck. Like I said, it's vulnerable to Blood Moon, but yet it's also playing Blood Moon. I've seen it play through a Blood Moon and counter spells and win. This deck, whether it's the control version, whether it's the elemental version, this deck is just ridiculous. You have to be prepared for it. It had a big showing at Pittsburgh this weekend. It had a big showing in some of the modern challenges this weekend. So as far as, decks that pop out in the beginning of the streets of New Campenna, this deck is certainly a deck that is on the rise, with the caveat that it's basically 4-color control. Just people decided to bust out the elementals recently. As far as the sideboard, Memory Deluge for a little bit of additional card grinding. Obviously, you're a Urion deck. You have a little bit of counter spells with some Dovin's Vetoes. You have some Veils of Summer to help protect your different pieces. You have some Endurances for any type of graveyard nonsense. Ragavan Darcy decks that might be floating around. 1 copy of Supreme Verdict in your multiple creature deck. Sure, why not? Meddling Mage, because you're in Eldamari's Call deck. Knight of Autumn is a nice little flex thing. Gives you some utility against decks like Burn, while also giving you some utility against any type of permanents you might want to remove, such as enchantments or artifacts. 2 copies of Chalice, because sure, why not? And then 1 Emrakul the Promised End, which I'm not really even sure why this one's in here. I would rather play, an actual Eldrazi for mill, but, you're generating this mana, you're playing that long of a game. You want an over-the-top card for the mirror and for the control? Sure, why the heck not? Alright, moving on to number 1. Finally, number 1, a deck we featured on this channel at some length. Well, not Burn, it is Burn adjacent in my mind. This is the Resonant Tempo deck of the modern format, the deck that probably stood to gain the most from Lurrus banning, etc. And that is it Murktide? This is the most powerful remaining Ragavan Darcy deck. It has Murktide Regent, it has Counterspell. basically, it gets to play the most efficient spells in the modern format, while having this tempo game plan, while also being able to play a controlling game plan in certain matchups. And once again, it's another deck that can play Blood Moon, but, how good Blood Moon in the format, we don't really know. But this is a deck that prides itself on efficiency and cantripping, does have some card advantage in the form of Expressive Iteration and Archmage's Charm, and then just tries to pressure the opponent and tempo them out before they can get set up with whatever they're doing. Whether they're an over-the-top Tron deck, whether they're a burn deck, etc. This deck has very close matchups across a lot of the board and really rewards proficiency with the deck as well as knowledge of the format. This is a deck that you're going to see a lot of your deck. Much like the Elementals deck, almost everything in this deck says draw a card, whether it be Consider, Expressive Iteration, Archmage's Charm. You don't see quite as many cards as the Elementals deck, but, one or two of is the same as a 3 or 4 of in a lot of decks. You play a very low land count, you're still a Mishra's Bauble deck, even though you don't obviously have the synergy with Lurrus anymore. And then you get to play Unholy Heat Lightning Bolt as very efficient removal. You get to play the most efficient counter spells in the format. And really, overall, this is just a very powerful deck. And it was the deck that Pygonti, which ended up being the trophy winner at the end of right before Streets of New Campenna. So this is a deck that's been iterated on a lot. It's a very powerful thing. You can play a lot of different things. As far as the sideboard, you basically have your anti-blue stuff and you have your anti-aggro stuff. You have your Flusterstorms for combo and control, along with things like Subtlety and Force of Negation if you want Mystical Disputes. Basically, whatever counter spells you want to run against the Cascade decks and against the 4-color control decks or 4-color Elementals decks. Subtlety also important for something like Teferi Time Raveler. A couple copies of Dress down here. This is primarily for the Urza Saga decks, although there's a lot. It can play a lot in the Elementals decks. Split on Blood Moon and Megas because of Boseiju floating around everywhere. Chandra Awakened Inferno, along with Jace, kind of your card advantage, grindy things against control. Then 2 copies of Engineering Explosives is kind of a catch-all, and then 1 copy of Relic of Progenitus. Because you want a little bit of graveyard hate, as we have seen, there are some powerful graveyard decks in the format. You still have Esper Reanimator running around, not very much, but you still have things like Living End and Dredge that'll pop up on occasion. So it's good to have access to these cards, and it never hurts to have 1 or 2 copies of Graveyard Hate in a deck that is going to see as many cards as this one is. So that's it. That's my top 5-ish, 6-ish decks for the beginning of the month of May. Once again, Streets of New Campenna could shake some stuff up. We did a video on cards I think that'll shake up the format there. The main card to be on the lookout for is probably Ob Nixilis. It's a card that's certainly been shaking up Standard. It's a card that certainly threatens to shaking up other formats, especially since you're basically getting 2 Planeswalkers for 3 mana if you have a creature in play. So that's certainly a card to keep on the lookout for, and that might bring black-based mid-range back to a little bit more prominence in the format. It's been lacking since Lurrus' banning. But that's it. Hope to see you for the next video. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.